We wanted to first do something on the topic of what does it mean to partner with to have partnerships between academics and community neighborhood organizations to advance goals around changing structural factors, changing policies, changing conditions in neighborhood, and for this conference, changing and as the Reverend said, seeking environmental justice. And so there's sort of two parts that we're kind of trying to test out here, and it's really kind of a dry run. I've done some of these things in the past, but we're really trying to do this around a new center that was formed. It's at Hopkins. It's called the Charmed Center. And a lot of the focus of Charmed is to actually take community concerns about environmental health, environmental justice, and say, what are they? How does the community define them? And what scientific tools and capacities could we bring to bear around them? Okay. In order to do that, you have to partner and you have to be in a dynamic and relationship with communities with a lot of changes over time, because things are constantly changing as far as a struggle for existence. We heard that from the Reverend. You're literally, having academics who have a certain set of priorities and things driving them, trying to partner with communities who are struggling to exist every day, right? So this is today, we're going to have session one be about sort of the background, the principles, the theory, and the practice, and who's doing it, and what are the motivating forces. And then this afternoon, not us as academics, we're going to have community leaders and community groups who've had experience in part two at 1:30, who are going to come and they're going to say, from their perspective, what's worked, what hasn't worked in academic partnerships, okay? So that's, I'm Chris Heaney. I'm at the School of Public Health at Johns Hopkins up in Baltimore. And I am, along with Dr. Jacoby Wilson, the co-lead from the academic side of what's called a community engagement core, okay? The community engagement core is part of Charmed, and for that particular Charmed center, being all about community concerns, everything starts with the community and comes under the community engagement core. I'll turn it over to Maddie, who's also at Hopkins and a big driver of Charmed too.
Sure. Hey everybody, thank you for coming. I'm really glad to put on this session, and as I mentioned before, this is going to be really interactive, so I'm excited to hear about your thoughts on some guiding questions that we're going to put forward pretty shortly. But I'm a recent graduate from Hopkins Bloomberg School of Public Health, and then I stayed on as a part of the faculty. And now so with the Charm Center, with Chris and his initiative, Community Science and Innovation for Environmental Justice. And then I also have the privilege of working with our partners in South Baltimore, and then also Dr. Graberton from Tufts University. And now
Hi everyone, I'm Nikki Graberton, and I teach anthropology. Do I need the mic or can folks hear?
Just for online, just in case.
Okay, sounds good. So I teach anthropology at Towson University, and I have been involved in this work for 12 years now, and started much more as someone who was in the world of activism and trying to merge both scholarship and activism. And I have the pleasure of working alongside these two great scientists. So we've been experimenting with how can both qualitative and quantitative work kind of advance the goals and the questions of EJ communities. So we've partnered around Charmed and citizen science, but actually we've been doing participatory action research for a very long time in Curtis Bay, even before this formalized relationship. So I'll get a chance to talk a little bit about that.
Great. And so we're going to start off just with giving some time for you to write down some answers to some questions that we think are at the core of how do you partner, how do you team up with academics? What are we trying to get at? Why are academics partnering with communities? And so we think that gets at some real key questions is, what is research to you? What is participation? What does that mean? Participating in a process with others? What is knowledge? Going to the core. Who creates knowledge? What is it and who creates it? And what is evidence to you and data? Okay. And then finally, what does action look like to you? All of those are kind of connected, but when we're trying to create and talk about partnerships between academic researchers and communities who are wondering about how to change conditions and fight for existence in the face of a range of toxic industries, right? Just maybe this is some reflections, and if people need a pen or a notepad, we can give that in questions, yeah. Well, how about we do word association, just words that come to mind. Well, it's kind of what we're looking at is we're going to dig into each of these and we're going to challenge some assumptions. So we're looking for people to just, what do you think of? What do you think of when you think of research? What comes to mind, right? And it's each going to be from a different perspective. If you're coming here as a part of a neighborhood group, a neighborhood advocacy group, you might see research and you might think, okay, that means this to me. But if you're a part of an academic research organization, we're looking for the different perspectives on these concepts and these terms, okay? That's what we're kind of looking, just to get a read from me. And we're gonna, at the end, we're gonna come back to these questions, okay? And revisit them.
So we'll take a few minutes just to get your thoughts together.
What comes to mind when you think about this from your historic position, your community organization, and write it from that perspective.
Feel free to chat with your neighbors as you go through these as well. How's it going, everybody? Quick check-in.
Yeah, how are we doing with this? Yeah, you can do, yeah, if you've got multiple ideas that goes over, that's fine. And this is, we recognize these are big questions, right? But we just want to get some reactions and kind of get a feeling for where people are coming from and their perspectives on it really, the motive. Why is there partnership between academics and communities? And in that space, the answers to these questions are really important. That's great. That's great. I know. I see one. I just have to read one. Who creates knowledge? Nature. Nature creates knowledge. And these are actually, these ideas are, as a part of what we're going to try to do, is to try to unpack who typically takes a front seat in driving public perception about who creates knowledge, who does research, who is a valid purveyor of new knowledge and who's not. And actually, yeah. So if you want to keep these questions going and keep thinking about your answers, you can keep the sticky tape, sticky notes, and the pens, okay? As we keep rolling through some of the ideas. Does that sound good?
That sounds great.
Yeah, we could go. Yeah. Give it a couple more minutes.
Okay.
Welcome, welcome. We're just getting started with some reactions to some questions that we have up here. We're going to give you a little sticky and a writing tool. We're just going to kind of reflect about. We also have the questions up on the white paper. Okay. No, that you're exactly right. So there's a clarifying question about how to approach the answer to the question, what is evidence, right? What is evidence in data? Because it could be one thing in a court of law. It could mean another thing in an academic setting. But that's exactly why we're asking these questions, because how everybody comes to a partnership as a neighborhood resident or an academic and their understanding of evidence, there can be differences of opinion, there can be conflicts, and that's where the root of a lot of is it authentic or is it not, what works, what doesn't work, gets hung up. Okay, so it's the idea that those are the ideas that we want to start to unpack. And I'm going to move forward a little bit to give you some ideas to hook around, because you are digging in to the space where we want to dig in. Does that make sense? Okay. What?
Can I quick introduce
Yes.
somebody? I'm Dan Recking, Jay Person.
Sure.
She used to work for your.
Chris, good to meet you. I'm sorry, my hand's so cold. This room is cold, and it's just. Hi, Terry. Great to meet you.
You know, I went to middle school in Baltimore.
Wow. All right. Oh, well, okay. All right. Good connection.
I said she worked for your, Jerome Shapiro.
Oh, wow. Oh, my goodness. Oh, that's great. Wonderful. That's great. Well, I can't wait to talk to you all both more. And we'll talk more during the workshop, all right? Yeah, we'll do like one more minute. Yeah. Power. That's good. Failures. I like this one. Storytelling, sharing. I like that. Yep. Good. This is great. I am seeing some great answers up here, some great ideas in all these questions, which are huge questions. I know we all recognize that. And so I'm gonna please, by all means, interactive. The setup is not exactly conducive to this, but move around. Think if you need to think by moving, writing on the sticky notes, and changing things as you want. Please, by all means. We don't like this whole structure of it being up here, but just to keep things going and kind of get sort of some things to help react, and as we can start to sink our teeth into, is that we're here at a conference on environmental justice, right? And we're in a room trying to talk about how do you team up with academics, how do you partner between communities and academics, and why are we doing that around environmental justice? Is that communities, neighborhood residents are living in spaces and places, fighting for their existence, and they're really looking, in many cases, for answers to questions that are, in the academic sense, causal questions, meaning, could you design a study that could be irrefutable? How long, how many decades did it take for the Surgeon General's warning to be accepted around smoking causes lung cancer? Right? Long time. But this is what people are dealing with about environmental exposures in their water. Is my water, in my home, in my community, safe to drink? Where I live, I look out the window and this is what I see. Is the air in my community safe to breathe, right? These are all causal questions, and academics at universities along these questions up here sometimes get labeled with terms like they have expertise, right? They are purveyors of knowledge, right? And so, what are the roles and responsibilities and capabilities to deliver answers to questions? And so often, when you get into courts, whenever you get into evidentiary proceedings and, with lawyers on opposing sides, there's discussion of bias, there's discussion of, validity, accuracy, all these technical terms, right? Which can be daunting to wade through. And so that's some of the reasons that there are partnerships between communities and academics. But what I think we want to dig into is around community partnership work, terms like community engaged research. We're going to think about what is it, who's defining it, and what forces are at play in the ability to, at the end of the day, get back here and try to improve environmental conditions, improve water, right? Improve neighborhood environments. So that's the goal today. We're going to give a little bit of background about the community engaged research. That's going to be a little bit of technical stuff this morning from the principles and the theory. But while we're sharing this information, we want you to keep thinking about how you thought about those questions in the beginning, and we're going to come back to those questions and try to have a discussion about it. Because when communities partner with academics and they're doing something that's community engaged research, or another term is community-based participatory research, essentially it's different levels of participation, right, by community residents. One of the first things you might hear is, well, the people who are most affected by exposure X, Y, Z are participating in the research process. It's biased. That's biasing things in some way, right? That's an oft said feature. So I think one of the things we want to really dig into and ask, it matters what the answers to these questions is in terms of the validity, the standing that neighborhood residents have in order to bring about new knowledge. And so this is probably, none of this is probably too unfamiliar to people who are at this conference. Part of what the Reverend said, you're speaking to the choir, you're preaching to the choir, right? But one of the things that we just want to acknowledge and go over is this community engaged research. It's a continuum, and it has to do with how you approach this as an academic and how you approach this as a community resident has to do with equity, involvement, meaningful involvement to actually change things. Do you have to neighborhood residents, when they partner with a community, with an academic, do they have the ability to change the budget? Do they have the ability to change the entire research question or hypothesis that maybe got things started? Or to say what that should be from the very beginning before anything is on the table. And so it has to do with equity indicators, involvement. Another way to say it is, it has to do with power, right? And I'm going to flip it, and Mr. Omega Wilson and Dr. Shakobi Wilson flip the script, where typically the power is in answering the questions to these. You have the university or experts who are driving what will cut mustard, what won't, in terms of trying to generate evidence all the way down the line. But stretching it and saying, what if you flipped it all the way around to where the community has lived with the problems for decades? The community owns the problems. They should be able to own the tools that could potentially help contribute to solutions. So that's this idea at the end: power, responsibility, leadership on the other side. And so this is the whole research, the circle is the research process, right? You have a question, you need a study design, right? And you go down the process of partnering up to do a study. You collect data, you go back around and you say, what do we know, right? And in a participatory process or community engaged research process, what do people think about the question, who creates knowledge? Who creates knowledge? Is it just an academic PI, or could a community organization be the ones creating the knowledge? Lived experience. I saw another one, storytelling. What is passed down from generation to generation about what do I know that my children need to know? And a lot of that comes from what you pick up and what you learn by your own experiences in your neighborhood and your community. What should you watch out for? Or is it typical in this space, and this is what we really want to tug at, is the university just taking the lead and saying, this is our expertise. We're going to involve you, but we're going to be in the driver's seat. And you can get on the bus, but we're still going to be in charge. And so the dynamic between this is what we're going to really think through, and really think about that with community engaged research around environmental justice. So I'm going to just skip through this. So the content will be online, but I really want to get to the point where we're thinking about power, okay? Because that is, and it was so great to hear the Reverend talk this morning, because essentially, I saw it up here. What is knowledge? Power. That was the answer a lot on the board. And so who's traditionally had power in the space of knowledge creation and evidence and data? And I think you are getting at this here, the gentleman up here on the right here. You were getting, who traditionally is at the table creating new evidence or data? I was just saying, because you were kind of chewing on this question earlier. Yeah. Mm. Yeah. Please.
In reality, research is decided by the graduate students and how much time they have to go out there and get the data to get their thesis, and the professor that has the money that'll fund it. That is the thing right there.
Because that's right. Starting with graduate students, I'm going to say, well, who supports graduate students? Right.
But you got to find somebody willing to do the work. And that's
But also, not only what this gentleman mentioned, there is a lot of power now in universities, corporations running the show in a soft way, but running the show. So they are going to produce the professionals they want for their purpose. So seeing from that perspective, change that collaboration of the research that want to be objective. But frankly, that is not objective at all. That is corporative. So we need to just be very real about that. But also, let's say that we are just talking without those forces of power, but what the European model represents, in which we are so anthropologically centered, anthropocentric, that we think we are still the center in the world. The rest is what happened around us. And that is a complete misleading distortion of what reality is, because the indigenous people have always said, we are nature. The Pope said it now, to understand what part we all are playing and what is happening in the planet. In that regard, we need to understand what Dr. Kermerit, in the beautiful book, Braiding Sweet Grass, she said, we need to go to the understanding that we are not only the ones observing, but we are also being observed. And that then completes a more comprehensive reality. But also we need to, as I said at the beginning, see what are the ones pushing us to do this or that. Because capitalism is pervading every single thing that we do. And we cannot solve things or transform things in this box.
And someone wrote, "What is knowledge in nature?" Or, yeah.
If you think about, is it on? If you think about like Isaac Newton, for example, he observed what was going on around him. Nowadays, like where we have a lot of pollution where we live, no one is observing and looking at what is around you. And I think you're right, it's market forces, but it's right there in front of you. I wrote nature also because it's there in front of you. And when healers looked and they found certain things, it was right in front of them. And I don't think that we don't do that now.
I would even argue that where you're talking about neighborhoods and conditions, environmental conditions, often it is deliberate in the not looking. It is intentional. Structural forces make it that way so that in specific places, for specific groups of people, they don't want these questions to unfold and be answered. So, Maria.
Add that you think of what we were just talking about in the other room, right? People, power, and politics. Politics influences who has power. I mean, if we look at states, if we look at agency heads, if we look at cabinets, the governor is appointing, people on his cabinet. They are beholden to. Same thing with, like, look how the EPA changed under different leadership.
Oh, absolutely. And I think that's actually a really good segue into the middle segment that we're going to do, which is going to get at a question that's not up here yet, but we're all kind of kicking around some ideas that I've thought about for a long time, and it's really about, who can answer these questions credibly to stand up in court or in academic peer review with rigor. But it's also about when you unpack people's opinions about, is science inherently objective or not? That's another really powerful concept. And so one of the things I think we're going to try to do is just think about all of these comments. Is science inherently objective? It's about recognizing our own privilege and where we come from. And that, what I mean by that specific to this workshop is, if you're living in a community with environmental problems and environmental injustice, and you're seeking partnerships with academics, it matters whether the academics that you're attempting or considering partnering with recognize the inherent privilege of the academic environment. The ivory tower, all of that, all of the privilege that goes along with that silo. And I think you were alluding to that a little bit as well. So this is a piece that just breaks apart. Sometimes we all have an inability, or we forget, or we don't recognize our inherent privilege that goes along with this. So when we approach scientific knowledge generation, thinking about your privilege is really, really critical, because privileged positions grant you access to specific conversations with specific constituents. I kick around the idea, clients, like scientists, we serve clients often, if you want to think about it. And why should a client, if you say it's a community who wants this question answered, is any inherently less objective or valid than if in an academic setting with privilege, you get up the ranks better if you know the clients who are the government funding agencies at NIH or CDC or a program officer who says, this is the big challenge we should be focusing and answering the research questions on. So if you really stop and think about the academic environment, when you're trying to reach out to academic collaborators, think about, and this is a heart, this is not just a brain thing, it's a heart thing and a gut thing. You have to think, are they driving an agenda that is consistent with me and where I live? Or is it an agenda that appears like, yeah, there might be a fit, but you have to tweak around, peg it to a square hole a little bit to make it fit for your, is my water safe, is the air safe, et cetera. So really it's about, in this process, how do you generate new knowledge? Who's deciding what research questions should be asked and prioritized? And how do these clients Often it's government funding agencies with millions, or the Infrastructure Act, billions. We're talking about billions of funding dollars. What is their priority? What questions do they want to address? What problems do they want to have addressed? So that's something that for public health science, it gets at whose, and it doesn't have to be epidemiology here, but it's whose research, whose scientific process effort for whose health or for whose goals. It could also be whose exposure environmental science for whose goals to achieve environmental justice, right? And so another thing I think about is, and this gets at politics, this gets at all of the things driving. Yes, you have a question. Yep. Yep. That's right. I think you're starting to unpack it and unravel it. Okay, there and where we're. Yeah, no, that's right. Can there be pure science? Some, as I've gone through this many times over the years, some people have said, well, science at the end, if you have the aspect of reproducing, continuing to ask the same question, reproduce, you will get to an answer that is believed to be defensible as an underlying truth, like a law of nature, a dynamic that is existing or not. But that, who said it, the observer versus being observed, right? That is true even down to particle physics, right? When you're observing and trying to learn a law of nature, even the process of observing, exactly. So I think there are some instances where, to answer a big global question, you do, as a scientific method, as can be applied through reproducibility, it can get at truth. But what I'm trying to focus on, and what we're trying to talk about today, is just the critique that is gonna come when you try to present evidence of a scientific nature in court. There's gonna be a process to try to discredit it, right? And tear it down. I've been through that several times over my career against any number of waste management industries, toxic industries. They wanna try to tear it down. And often, to help us in this dialogue and partnership, one of the things that comes is, the community participated, wait, that's biased. They're the ones that are the most vested interest in seeing something change. So substitute corporate special interest this is a trick. It's trying to substitute the corporate special interest as being biased with neighborhood resident, and they're biased. So that's why all of this is sort of the key thing about whose epidemiology, whose health. Yeah.
A couple things come to mind. I think number one, I used to work at a university, and we used to call these 3 a.m. brainstorms, where somebody comes up, wouldn't it be great to study whatever, and then you go out into the community and you use them for the research, and then you publish, and bye community. Versus if community, and I'm using this word community, if they have a question that they want to answer, and then you actually work with them to identify the methods and the evidence and what it is they're trying to do, like, then that becomes different because of what the institution is saying, what the funding is saying, and all that. But I think that all of this comes down to, like, respecting citizen science. And so there's a lot of that citizen science work for the natural world, for birds. Cornell has done such a great job with that, but as if you could take that and apply it to social science or people's observations about what is happening in their community, then that's something, right? And so that's actually, I'm from Delaware, and that's what I'm kind of trying to push for some of these things that we see in our state. And I'm like, citizen science, and so I think that's right.
All, like, research, science, what's knowledge, if citizen community science, is it raining today or not? Crowdsourcing. I mean, there's certain things that we as a human beings existing on the planet know. So it's just the question we're trying to unpack is, when you get into these very specific scenarios to try to adjudicate things that matter from city planning, permitting, an industrial facility versus a green space versus a community-led movement for development. That's where who has access to the data process, who gets respected, who is validated in terms of the knowledge that's put forward. Because it all starts at a certain place with this sort of paying attention to conditions around you and where you live. So one of the things, yeah.
For what you are just saying, I think it's very important to bring this historic research that were put it in secret, like oil was going to destroy the planet. They knew it in 1970s, okay? And they didn't share. The tobacco industry was going to create lung cancer. The pharmacy were going to kill and create a society dependent on opioids that produced the opioid crisis. So, and this was our research, but remember the dynamics is we didn't supposed to know to let them happen. So this is strong evidence that knowledge and research well done in a scientific way didn't have that component of social justice. So when objective research is criminalized by not being able to show, and the word was, there is a doubt. All the other scientists that wrote about tobacco, oh, there is no conclusive. It's not conclusive. It's using the science to create an injustice.
Right. And the position of waste is downstream to who? Who sets the rule, the institution-making rule of where the position is observed? Who's upstream to who, downstream to who, just right to who? Who sets the institutional conditions that establishes that? Creates the corporation, keeps them in place, all of that. The university.
That's absolutely right. Yeah, and we going back to an earlier comment, which is connected to all of these questions, is corporate sponsorship of academic departments, funding of training grants for graduate students to be able to do their training, right? So this is happening at schools of public health across the country where government funding of the training is drying up and companies are stepping in. You're absolutely right. I think one of the things that we're just trying to build towards, and just sort of in the interest of time, is just to say that there is this dynamic whenever communities are participating in research, right? Where if the goal is structural change, social justice, environmental justice, right? We just need to anticipate and do our homework on what's coming. The ability to try to tear down the science or the research. And so this idea of kind of embracing, why should it inherently be any less objective if the question that wants to be answered is coming from the community rather than a company, or rather than, and a company is the probably the most far apart juxtaposition, right? But just say it's a government sponsored funding agency, right? Who academics are often, I'm saying these things to sort of maybe turn on light bulbs if you're interacting with academics from the community side, to be able to recognize some things that might be potentially, heart and gut in a gut check moment. Yeah.
I'm a physician, and none of us ever believe industry sponsored research. That makes sense, doesn't it? Would we believe what the drug company says? It has to be substantiated. If we could take this and put it in a larger context, it would be really easy to understand corporate sponsored research versus community sponsored or involved research. But folks don't look at it that way. Where we live, the government is managed by developers. And we have an institution, a marine science institute right down the street from where our polluted water goes. This is helpful because my husband said, well, maybe we can get the university to look and see how polluted our wetland is. But so now we have to be careful because we have gone to Coast Day and they have some pretty esoteric experiments, not the one that's right outside to see how polluted this water is. But this is very helpful because now we know how to look.
How deep are the research questions digging into the structural injustices? Yeah. So I'm going to try to just sort of move a little bit more through this, but just the idea of we need to be on, okay, I'm going to say just to ease of to share, but if you're going to sign up to do partnership, community engaged research or community partnership research, where environmental justice is the goal of the knowledge generation, we have to be better and do better and hold ourselves to a higher standard, often than examples that you might see in potential, not potential, but some examples we know of where corporate sponsored research, they go to great lengths to not allow it to be known where the money is coming from, okay? And some of this is in the, renting white coats, ghost writing, literally companies doing the research, having a data set already knowing the answer, and then finding an academic to go who could basically publish it. And then you never know that it was actually done in government spaces. And that's something here that was in the Monsanto cases. And so, or, having advocacy positions that are taken where it's not clear solutions to the climate crisis here, national survey that was done. The public, I think, can sniff this stuff out, right? And some of the answers here were from the public is they would believe, and potentially try to embrace the solutions, but they would raise questions if it was sort of like nuclear, and it was a nuclear sponsored, right, kind of line of evidence. So it's a really interesting concept there. And you can get in the middle of this and you can try to do good, but this is sort of the purpose of this workshop is also on the academic side to make sure that we don't make missteps as well. And so there's just some examples of what I think are good models. Was a mentor, Dr. Jacoby Wilson. I had Steve Wing, who's done this, where he has a whole line of decades of research where he really partnered equitably to the top of every single decision-making process and had really good lines of research to try to generate scientific evidence that could hit back in the debate around industrialization of factory animal farming, okay, and hog farming in North Carolina. And so where we're going is, if you're interested in partnership work, all of that stuff about the prelude is just to be aware of, the attacks on credibility and validity and objectivity are going to come. So we're on the bus, we're doing this together. Because if we know that, then we know we should hold ourselves to a higher standard, because we could potentially disbelieve corporate sponsored research. And if it's community, we should, have the same level of critique. But then we can get into what is our methodology? How rigorous is our scientific approach? Your community academic your communities are partnering with academics. Do they know what it's like and what's coming next to do this kind of community participatory research? So that's where we get into methods. What questions do we decide to pursue? Where do we look? And knowing that there's an inherent uncertainty in science, any single study can't really, change things entirely, and that it's super powerful, the position often of industry who may know data that the fossil fuel industry 40, 50 years ago knew about the harms, because doubt as a product is super powerful, okay? Yeah, that's right. And so it's in science, it's known, we know that the absence of evidence, which is doubt, is not the same as evidence of the absence of harm, right? Okay. But creating a whole structural system like in the wetlands and where all the research that could get close doesn't cut to the core of the issues of what the neighborhood residents are living with. That's something where it's the lamppost. You never looked to the core. I love Mr. Burns here because he's like, basking under the glow of the light of this lamppost. That's the energy is produced by his nuclear power plant in The Simpsons. But your lamppost epidemiology, you can answer all these questions because the light from the lamppost is illuminating this little area. But you never stopped to bring the lamppost over to this neighborhood and have the light shine here. Okay, so that's something that is involved in the participatory aspect. And so, methods can be misused. This is a neat paper where there was a corporate-sponsored review of do industrial factory animal farms adversely affect public health? And they published it in, I think it was like Systematic Reviews and Meta-Analysis. And they reached the conclusion, no. We reviewed the literature, we did the scientific approach, and there's no harms out there. And then a group of faculty and other people said, you didn't look, you had lamppost epidemiology, you ignored a lot of knowledge around. So this is just the idea. And finally, one of the things I think is rationalization, and this affects us, every single one of us in the room. What the Reverend was talking about is comfort. We all want to have a comfortable life. We all want to support our families. And so this is sort of, I say, eighth deadly sin, but we need to talk about a self-awareness and even go to self-criticism in this work and be able to, the community partner needs to be able to point out to the academic partner with no adverse repercussions whenever something might not be sitting right in your gut, right? And that you could have the freedom and self-determination to go there with the academic without a fear that the academic would pull up their roots and leave and go to another community and go community shopping in a way. So this is something that it's not a weakness to be self-critical, but this is something that is sort of the way that I'd like to break down a lot of these issues on the path to that. So with those, we had such a good discussion. We had great setup of a lot of the ideas of knowledge production and what's coming, right? And we were now going to give an example from Curtis Bay of some participatory action research through Dr. Fabricant and Maddie, and then keep the discussion coming, keep the questions coming, and we'll come back to some of these questions at the end.
Great. So I think Maddie and I are going to sort of tag team this part since it's a case example for you. By all means, we're interested in having this as conversational as possible. So I just wanted to start off with like, what is critical participatory action research for me as a social scientist? My politics or my commitments to social justice were never severed from my teaching. Those are armies of students that can be involved in some of the struggles, or to thinking about how do we do research that is non-extractive, right? Because all of our universities, as was articulated, are part of this kind of extractive model, essentially, and individualistic productivity. And I think this team and our collaborative effort is sort of a model, perhaps, for how do we do things in a much more solidaristic fashion than as coming in as experts. So critical participatory action, just briefly, for those who are not aware of it, is that those who are impacted should be the ones guiding the research. We as academics should harness the resources of our institutions because they are filled with resources and figure out how to get that to communities. So the idea is that those impacted are leaders in shaping the questions, framing interpretations. I think you mentioned something about, people are living with environmental inequities every single day. They see, they hear, they feel. They should be the experts, right? And that knowledge is so critical, I think, to how we think about these long-term relationships. So obviously CPAR, if you don't know, is allied with feminist, critical race, indigenous theory, everything that's being eviscerated now in places like Florida. And I have colleagues out in Texas. So this is a model that pushes back against, right, the traditional, or as Chris was talking about, this sort of bizarre idea that research and science is objective. I don't have time to go through the values of CPAR, but I do have a sheet to share with people about what some of the values are and the assumptions, just that the impacted communities, EJ communities, are part of every phase of the research, from research design to data collection to dissemination. And we want to talk through kind of how we've thought about that down in Curtis Bay. So if you're interested more, I would highly recommend checking out the Public Science Center at CUNY. The City University of New York has a long history of doing this kind of research across social science and physical science. We have taken young people from Curtis Bay to be trained in this method so that they've acquired the tools. I think Chris mentioned, owning the tools. Who has the ability, right? The power to kind of hold on to those tools, to utilize those tools, and to empower others. So they've been doing this for a very long time. And then the idea is that our research should create structural change, right? It shouldn't be separate and severed from the remedy, right? Which oftentimes is pretty intricate. So this is South Baltimore. I wanted to spatialize us. We are talking about 6 communities that are right on the waterfront that have historically been overburdened by industries. Baltimore has placed lots of its waste industries within miles of one another in this South Baltimore region. I think 70 plus, right, polluting industries are located. So we can talk about incineration, landfills, non-renewable fossil fuel industries, petrochemical, fertilizer, and chemical. Am I missing any other industries?
Probably anything that you can think of.
Yes. So literally our government, right, has been utilizing these lands as a sacrifice zone for a very long time, benefiting from industrial expansions. And then communities have been adversely impacted, right? That question of who has the right to breathe clean, fresh air is one that folks do not take for granted in Curtis Bay. So Maddie has so generously shared some of these like industrial pollution sites. And we often talk about all this as cumulative impact. It's very hard for science and social science to disaggregate and be able to say it's this one industry causing harm. I describe it in my EJ classes as they protect one another. They hide behind each other, and it's almost a way that they're not held accountable, right, for the harms that have been created. So these are some of just the air pollution sources. And in 2015, the model really came out of organizing. And I want to make that very clear that young people at Benjamin Franklin High School, which is the local high school in Curtis Bay, pulls from all 6 of those communities you saw, we're doing this work before the academics came in. And it's really important to like amplify and highlight that. They got wind that the largest trash to energy incinerator was going to be built a mile from their high school. Back in 2010, they started the research. They started asking the questions. They brought those questions to a study group and reflected upon it. Like, what is incineration? Why would garbage be shipped in from all over the country, literally a mile from us? How did they evade regulatory apparatus to be able to have an incinerator that close to the school? So they were looking at structural questions, right? And then Chris and I got involved because the youth built out a dream team. This was their dream team, right? And they were like, we want to harness the academics that could provide a particular skill or tool. So obviously public health and science was so critical to their thinking about research, right? And then they were building out environmental justice lawyers that would help in a legal apparatus and other academics that might be aligned, right? Or willing to work in solidarity. So we pulled from their model. This was the group called Free Your Voice. They were doing this work. And Destiny Watford, who was an incredible young environmental justice organizer, she won the Goldman Award for her incredible activism. I oftentimes describe it as a David versus Goliath because I don't think any of us expected that we would win this victory against the transnational corporation with resources, money. But back to, earlier, when you have a much broader movement and people power, there are and you're doing the research yourselves. They were incredibly savvy, right, with the data and how to utilize the data. So she said to me, we would really like to train people inside the high school. How could we get young people thinking about these questions of environmental injustice at 15, 14 years old? Because they have come to just almost become numb to their environment, right? They might see the largest open air coal pier and walk by it, but it's become so naturalized that thinking critically about those broader structures was never a part of our educational apparatus. So she said, let's think about bringing what we do as a group into a classroom. How could you leverage the university? So we started a partnership in 2015 where Towson was able to provide 3 college credits, the high school students who are doing their own research from an impacted community. So they start off with the question. We don't come in, right? And we share the philosophy of what participatory action research is. You know, the big question is, why do certain communities unevenly experience environmental justice? But they could go whichever route they're passionate about. So some want to look at food access and the lack of supermarkets as an EJ concern. Others are really tied to this question of vacants and housing and how the vacants attract all sorts of dumping practices in their community. So even posing the questions is a way of starting that critical lens, right, into how do you systematically now study these kinds of problems. Oftentimes we get crime, policing, questions of over-policing EJ communities. So this is one group from 2016 that their question was, why are there so many vacant homes in our community and who owns these? How would we go about tracking ownership? And so this is what they wound up doing with citywide data. So they pulled the city tracks, right, on all the vacants that have ordinances, basically who owns these homes. And they wound up finding out that 517 of the vacants in Curtis Bay, if you could see, it's quite illustrative that they don't live in that community, right? They're holding on to land, they're speculating. And this is a huge trend we see across Baltimore as the market is turning, as gentrification is creeping into some of these areas. There are lots of LLCs, right, that are interested, and they hide behind LLCs and they speculate on land and hold on to it and never invest until the market works to their advantage. So this was an incredible cohort. They were out doing ethnographic work. Some of this is them just doing observations, right? Like, what do the vacants look like? Yes, you have a question? Right. Absolutely. That's a really good insight, right? Is just the question of being held accountable for sitting on vacant lands and not doing any form of development, really. Absolutely. So what I want to illustrate here, and then it leads directly into the science, is that this became critical to a much broader campaign. So across the city of Baltimore, people were fighting for affordable and fair housing. A lot of their research fed directly into the fair development campaign, where folks from all over the city kind of came together to pass a charter amendment for a fund, a pot of money that would support the building of land trusts and other forms of affordable housing. And it was properties over a certain amount were taxed, right? So that kind of redistributive model, it's had all sorts of problems along the way, but nevertheless, these images became fodder or critical for the fight, right? Where really people from East Baltimore, West Baltimore, and South had to come together to say, really, we don't have any pot of money to build equitable, sustainable kinds of futures, right? So yes, I mean, I think they're constantly cognizant of, is the data going to advance the social justice claims, right? Or what the movement might be fighting for. So I wanted to turn things over to Maddie because we're doing really cool things with science and humanistic. So how can physical science complement some of the observational and the more humanistic? And together, I think we're even more powerful in sort of providing tools, turning the tools over to communities, because really it's like releasing the tools from being held hostage by universities, right? So is there a way that these tools can become really useful to communities who have had the questions for a long time, but don't get the same validation that an individual researcher would get, right? So the 2023 Ben Franklin cohort is when Maddie and Chris and myself kind of joined forces, and I'll turn things over to Maddie.
Awesome. Thank you, Nikki. So I mean, this wasn't a. I'm so privileged to have been a part of this, or a part of this team and a part of this cohort of amazing high school students and youth leaders. Some of which you'll be hearing from during the lunchtime plenary session, actually. So I want you to be able to hear directly from them and listen to some of the amazing work that they put together over the summer. So I'm going to try to keep it a little bit short, but I think that this is an amazing example of how we can really focus on, and I'm going to go to what's at the very bottom about learning and about co-learning, and go into the question that we have on one of the post-it notes about what is knowledge and who is creating it. And the youth are often a group who are left out of the answer to that question, even though we all know that kids pay attention to things and that they have a really in-depth understanding of the world that's going on around them. But often what can be really helpful is having a space like a classroom to actually reflect on those things that they're experiencing and that they're observing with others who are experiencing a lot of those similar injustices for this example of an environmental justice class. And so with this, or actually, could you go back real quick? Going back to the learning is a two-way street, and how it's, I think, a testament to the power of youth participatory action research and community engaged research, is that as somebody who's an academic coming into that classroom with high school students, I had so much to learn from them that I wasn't even thinking about initially when I came into that class. I think it's easy to be able to be like, I'm at the front of the classroom, we're asking questions about environmental justice and environmental health, and I'm going to talk to you about it. But the thing is that they had a lot of feedback for me. And also just a lot of input about what does environmental justice look like in their own communities. And so one thing that we started out with from the actual activities that they will be doing is 5 sense ethnography. So basically taking in or using their 5 senses in order to take in what is going on around them, and really trying to emphasize that this is a part of building power and a part of building evidence that can be used for environmental justice initiatives and for making change. And that and it's part of introducing this community science idea. And it's not just about the most technical instruments that you can put together, but it's about the way that you observe the world around you and the way that you take that as important, as valuable information, and then use it towards action and towards doing something with it. And you can go to the next slide. And so for this 2023 spring cohort, a lot of the work that we were doing was framed in an effort as a part of an ongoing environmental justice movement and effort around the CSX coal terminal in Curtis Bay, which is an open air coal terminal. There was a photo of it a few slides back, but it's just picture a mountain of black coal less than 1,000 feet away from the community's recreation center, less than 1,000 feet away from people's homes. Right, so in the top right. And you can see that juxtaposition of there's a literal playground, children playing, and right in the background there is a mountain of coal. And this mountain of coal, and actually it's just, that's only one of a series of these piles of coal that are in the community. And at the end of 2021, there was an explosion at that facility. This explosion, it shattered windows of people's homes nearby. There were testimonies of families and kids and parents who were traumatized by that, understandably, by that event. And so a lot of the work that we were doing during this class was centered around ongoing work, community science work, and also organizing and advocacy around addressing that source of community concern. And so this a qualitative piece of what we did with the students was put together this survey for Benjamin Franklin High School students and teachers and staff about what are understandings of environmental justice. both as a concept and then also in your own community. So we ask questions, we develop questions like, do you trust the water that you're drinking? Do you trust the air that you breathe? Do you know about the explosion of the CSX coal terminal? And so trying to get an understanding of what students and what people at the school actually understand about environmental justice, so that we can take that information and then develop communication to the whole school and to the school community, about educating about environmental justice in South Baltimore and also conceptually. And so this is kind of a part of an ongoing process, and where in the next cohort of students, this is something that we'll continue to refine this survey, and continue to put out to the school community. And as I mentioned before, there's also this community science aspect, and where we are bringing students and bringing this class into ongoing work in the community that was that formed from research questions that were developed by folks in the community of Curtis Bay Association, by South Baltimore Community Land Trust, and other residents who have been involved with meetings and activities that are put on by those organizations. And so this is so what we're seeing on the screen here is, I think, the pieces that make up an air monitoring network in the Curtis Bay community. And this came from the establishment of research questions and community concerns by residents. And kind of we came in on the science side and had to figure out, alongside our community partners, how can we take those questions and then bring in some scientific and technical expertise to get answers to the things that residents have been or to the questions that residents have been asking for literally decades and even over 100 years. And so these air monitors, cameras are kind of tools that we're using to get to answers to those questions. Go to the next slide. And so we had the students learn about how to use those instruments, learn what the data that they were gathering actually meant, and then how can they be used for action for structural change in our community, or in the Curtis Bay community. And so this is an example of one of the slides that the students put together about from their own research about what are the health effects of coal, and kind of setting the stage for the community science work that I mentioned. Also for more information about the coal terminal and other industrial polluters, industrial facilities within the Curtis Bay community. And on the left, you can see this bar graph, and that's actually from the survey that the students put out. And this is a question asking about, have you or anyone in your household experienced a respiratory disease or a respiratory issue? A lot of students said that they really weren't sure, but a lot also talked about asthma, lung cancer, allergies, emphysema. And so I think it was really powerful for the students to, and this is something that they said, that powerful to see that the issues that we're talking about in this classroom are things that are experienced by their peers and by their teachers and by the people that they interact with on a daily basis, but they're not necessarily things that that the students have thought about as like these are big issues. I think it comes back to this like rationalization piece, or like it's a part of everyday life, and so you don't always see it as big a problem as it is. So I think that was a really eye-opening experience for a lot of students. Here's some more information that the students put together about the CSX coal pier and other parts of that huge complex where there's coal carrying trains that are uncovered that are going through other South Baltimore communities. And so this was a part, the coal pier is in Curtis Bay. The coal is coming to the coal pier through these other South Baltimore communities. And I think this was an important point because it's showing how these environmental justices are related, injustices are connected and interconnected between communities. And it's a point for showing that here's a way that we can really build power against people power and mobilize with other community groups and other students as well at other schools around these environmental justice injustice concerns. And then here's just some more information or some more data that was gathered over the course of the class. On the left, you're seeing some more outputs from the survey that the students created. On the right, you're seeing some of the air quality data. So we put an air monitor at Benjamin Franklin High School And it was fun to go through the data sometimes because we would put it up on the screen and then students would say, oh, you know, that spike in particulate matter, for example, was probably from people riding their dirt bikes by or something like that. But students were able to be grounded or I guess ground the data that we were gathering, which I think is something that's really special, that I think a lot of people in these scientific silos, academic silos, are getting all this data, making these graphs, but they're practically meaningless when you don't have an actual understanding of the context. And so that's where it's amazing that these students are experts, and they're even though I think they hadn't or been given the opportunity to really show their expertise before. So I think that this was a pretty cool exercise of something that we did regularly in looking at this data. And so now this is kind of where I lead into what's, I think, going on in the session that's going on right now, where a couple of the students from the 2023 cohort joined a summer program called the Summer Youth Environmental Justice Scholars Program, sponsored by the Charm Center and also the South Baltimore Community Land Trust and Community of Curtis Bay Association. And a couple of students came from the class. A couple of other recent graduates were actually one recent graduate also came from the class. Another one came from already doing existing work with South Baltimore Community Land Trust and other community organizing initiatives in South Baltimore. But this was an awesome 8-week program that just finished last or a couple months ago, where students were coming in to get more in depth with the community science work that we had discussed in the class, and that had been ongoing with community community academic partnership in Curtis Bay and in South Baltimore. And students were paid for their time over the summer, and they were kept on the payroll after the program was finished, so that they can continue to do the work. So if they so choose, and if they would like to. And then they also receive college credits for, or actually this goes back to the Ben class, but they receive college credits for going through the course for the 2023 spring term. And so this was an amazing opportunity just to have students get more involved in community science, and that's, I think, what they're talking about now in the Grand Ballroom plenary session. So I do want to move to that, but so please tune in to the amazing work that they did over the summer. And then I'm going to go to the, yeah.
So I think hopefully this gave you an example of how we return to some of these questions and really interrogate our preconceived notions of research versus participation. That communities hold an incredible amount of knowledge, lived experience. I think Maddie emphasized that, the ways in which it contextualized some of the data.
Yeah, and just to thank everybody for coming. And this is like our first attempt to try out to show some of the principles in the theory that could be usable. And I think what I picked up is it kind of tapped into a lot of people's questions about what we were asking you to do with answering these, because ultimately what this conference, as we convene and talk to each other, we want to help each other find access to the resources to get knowledge and get evidence and data that could help in the struggle, in the battle. And so just recognizing that sometimes, taking what may come can, in an academic partnership, it may feel extractive, and it may feel like it's just getting around the margins of not getting to the core of the question, like some of the wetland stuff you're talking about. So it's just all of those issues, and basically to have it be speak up, tell the academics, call us out. Like it doesn't really work if the power structure isn't ever challenged. I think that's the key thing. And so we thank you. And then this afternoon, we're going to have a panel of community leaders who are going to answer from their perspective what's worked and what hasn't. And if things are going right, people will be calling me out, right? As, hey, Chris, you're not doing this or that or the other. That's the way it's healthy, and that's the way it's functioning. And every community academic partnership I've ever been in, I've had that expectation that I better get called out, including in public, because that's where it works, and that's moving down the path towards the power balance, and that there's confidence that I wouldn't pick up and go away and find another community that's not going to challenge the power dynamic. So yeah.
This was a one class cohort. Is it going to be continuing with each new
Yes.
class?
Yep.
Yep.
And may it be
We
hoped
build
that
off of
there will be clamoring to get into the cohort because of the immediacy of the impact on residents?
Right.
So the class might be getting larger.
Yeah, I hope so. Yeah.
I have another question. You lingered very briefly on a slide of a survey among your peers, academic researchers.
Nobody can hear you.
Oh. We didn't see the results of that survey. Did the academics responding indicate that they recognize they're in a profession of grift and graft, or not? I mean, what was the response to that survey?
They did recognize.
Okay, I'm going to call you out.
All right.
They did recognize corporate influence. Yes, they did. That was the idea behind that public survey.
I think if something very important for me to say also, and you are okay with me to saying, is that sometimes the evidence is there, the evidence is known, like domestic violence, for example, but the way to co-opt that was to ask for data. And there was decades of data research while women were still dying. That's a co-optation of the issue.
That's another thing is when is enough data enough, and you don't need more data. That's absolutely right. Oh, good. I'm so glad. Yeah, we're gonna. Yep.